dot. Good job, Danny. Awesome job this morning.
Try to keep us
Yeah,
on
yeah.
time.
Oh,
How's
and
your
for those of you
oh
watching on our YouTube channel, come join us on Facebook. It is a pretty cool place where you can interact with a bunch of other coders who do lots of stuff that you do, mainly procrastinating and, following tutorials halfway and not completing any
Feeling like an
projects. But you can
imposter,
do that with other people. You don't have to do that alone.
we keep you accountable. That's the whole point. You need some
That's the
community,
goal.
right? I think that's like the biggest problem that most developers have is they're trying to learn this
I
stuff
think
in the
that's the
void
biggest
of
problem most people have.
yeah, you're trying to learn it on your own and it's tough to keep yourself accountable and do, you know, the best job that you can possibly do. And so
Because
we
we
have
need
an
to live our
amazing
best
community.
life.
Yeah, we have an amazing community and we'll keep you accountable and make sure that you're learning all the time. We have lots of value posts inside the Facebook group. So come join us over at facebook.com/groups/code noobs, one word, and join the
Or you could just
community.
click the link down in the description.
Yeah, you could click the link as well.
Mhm.
How are you guys doing this week? What have you been up to? Been doing some coding?
A little
Mm.
coding, getting a project finished up, it's ready to deploy next week, but also getting
Nice.
over being sick. So it's been kind of it's been a long month for me.
Yeah,
You know, it's
I
been
feel you.
very long.
I've started rebuilding an old project of mine this week, which
That was
is
looking good though.
cool. Yeah, it's looking good. I'm pretty psyched about it. Going off of a little, um, design, website design, so it's coming out nice. But it takes a while, so
It does, it
just
always
going
takes,
through it.
it's funny because like every time I build something, it's like you can, the front end part is like easy to get caught up in, but it's also easy to like estimate the time. But really, you like
Yeah.
the back end, I always underestimate how long that's going to take me. Just because like, you never
You
really,
saying you always get stuck in the back end, Danny?
you're
Is
right.
that what you're saying?
No, like always like the logic and stuff. Like you never really like in your head, you're always like, but you take 2 minutes. And then like, but it really doesn't. It takes a lot longer. So it's
It
like,
does. Yeah, it takes a while.
it takes about as long as
That's
it does
something
to
we
build the
talk a
front.
lot to students about inside the web dev incubator is like when you estimate how long a project's going to be, you should probably add like another 25 to 50% on top of that
Oh, especially
because
if you're just starting out. Yeah, at least because
yeah. Good morning, Chris. How are you this morning? Yeah, and did you guys watch that Mike Tyson Jake Paul fight last night? I know I did.
Yeah.
I was let down. I thought it
Yeah,
was going to be
same.
so much more violent and Jake Paul was going to go down and everyone was going to cheer. And it's kind of
Yeah.
funny like he was the event promoter, like he put on the whole event and as soon as he walked out people were just like booing him. Like the whole time because everyone's just watching it to see him go down. So
that's
Hmm.
why he
I
doesn't
guess
fight
that's
Well,
anybody that's.
there was no way that he could win. It was like if he knocks out Mike
yeah.
Tyson, everybody's gonna hate him. If he gets knocked out by
Mhm.
Mike Tyson, everybody's gonna be like, "Ha ha, Grandpa
Yeah. Basically,
killed you."
everyone just hates
And
him already, I think
yeah,
is the point.
yeah,
Like,
uh-huh.
nobody
But
actually
he wanted
likes
to
him,
make
but
some money off of people not liking him,
exactly.
which he did.
So, what a business model.
Hmm.
Yeah. Good morning, Bryce. So, yeah, with that, let's get right into the topic. So, today's video is all about the top mistakes that junior developers make. And I think this was a great topic because we all want to be a senior developer, right? We all want to be this like expert jack of all trades, amazing developer who can code everything in their sleep and doesn't
Well,
need
we
to
all we
look
all
at
imagine ourselves,
documentation
right? We
or
all imagine ourselves as badass. Like somebody's like, "Can you make this?" And you're just like, blah, 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 blah.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like hackers. We're like, da, 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 all right, we're
I
in.
love those
We
old
hacked into the
hacking movies.
mainframe.
The way
I
they
love
hacked
those.
it,
I
it was
love
like,
those movies, like the most recent Mission Impossible, where they're like in the airport and they're like, "Oh, they kicked us out of that. Hang on, okay, I just hacked the satellite," and it's just
Yeah.
like, "Oh yeah, sure,
I hacked the satellite to open the door.
and
yeah."
it's just like, and they're just like, brrr, like super
Yeah.
fast. It takes 2 seconds. You're like, what are you doing?
Just
Mhm.
smashing the keys.
First of all, if you're a real hacker, he's like, hold on, let me install Kali. Pull up these programs.
Oh
Yeah.
man. What's up, Chris number two? We got two Chris's in the house this
All
morning.
right.
What's going on, guys? Yeah. So I think this is a great topic because one of the things that I think most people want to do is get out of the junior developer phase as quickly as possible and get to that mid-level, senior level. And so, I think there's a bunch of pitfalls that junior developers make, both in terms of their education, but also what I think is really important is how you market yourself, right? When you're going out to find a job, I think one of the main reasons why people struggle to find work as a developer when they're first getting into it is because they make these good morning, Charles. They make these like really, I would say, basic mistakes that make it obvious to other developers that they are junior,
You mean they
Right.
right?
list every technology they've ever heard of on their resume?
Yes,
That's
that's a
one
big
of
one.
them for sure, right? So when
I
you
think you
go to
also
a
mentioned
boot
another
camp
one.
or what's
Well,
that? Yeah.
you already mentioned another one earlier too, which is like also too not knowing how to estimate your time too. If you're doing like freelance jobs
Mm,
and stuff is also a big one, I think. And like,
yeah.
it's hard when you start out. And I think we all want to get to that place where we can like say to ourselves confidently, like I'm a developer, and
Yeah.
not feel like we're lying, right? That's like the spot I think most people want to be at. But what that is kind of hard to imagine sometimes too.
Yeah. Well, I think you make a good point because that's something that we coach a lot of people on who join our web dev incubator program is this embodiment issue of when you when you start developing, you feel like I know I went through this. I'm sure you guys did too, but like tell me if I'm wrong. Did you feel like you had to sort of reach some sort of accomplishment or some end goal before you could start calling yourself a developer? Did you ever get that? Like, or a
Oh
hacker
yeah.
in your case, Randall?
Yeah. Like,
Right? Like,
first live project maybe, or like first time you get paid, but even that's not even a good marker, I don't think, because that's like
yeah.
you still feel
And
green, right?
and the goalpost keeps on moving. You
Yeah.
know, for me it was first like, oh, if I just get the Security Plus certification, oh, if I get the
Yep.
Pen Test Plus certification, oh, if I get the OSCP certification, oh, if I get my bug bounties done, oh, if I do that, and it's just like, the goalpost
Yeah.
keeps moving.
Well, I think that's part of it, right? Because technology moves so fast and there's so much now. Like I think people forget that. Like, dude, when people
Yeah.
started out like 50 years ago, there just wasn't that much. Like it was definitely harder to learn. Don't get me
You
wrong.
want
Like
to
I think it
learn
was
programming? Here's C.
yeah, I mean like well that's it, right? Like it was definitely way harder to learn it because like there
Yeah.
wasn't as many resources, but like there was just way less stuff too. And I think now like it's hard because like the more you learn, the more you just realize like, oh my God, there's I can just keep learning.
Yeah.
And even if I get tired of doing whatever I'm doing now, I can just move over a little bit to the left or right and start a whole new path of learning like something
Yeah.
completely different.
You
Yeah.
know, you made me think of something. Also, I feel like back then the technology didn't evolve as quickly, right?
No.
So, like one of our group members, Anthony, asked me the other day, he was in the Telegram group and he was like, do you think there's ever going to be like an HTML6 and like a CSS4 or whatever? And I was like, probably not. And then I did some research on it. And a few years ago, I think they've like debated this topic before. And basically, I think they kind of came to the conclusion of we're not going to ever change it. We're just going to keep adding like small incremental updates. And I think that's what happens with a lot of software now. I mean, obviously, there's larger updates for software, but most of these things evolve so quickly that it doesn't make sense releasing like large versions of things anymore, right? When
Yeah,
we
no, I
used
think
to do that in the past.
when you asked
Because,
that question, I actually looked it up too, and I think that's the other thing with CSS and like HTML now. Like, if you think about it, like browsers are super advanced now, but like
mhm,
what you can like with what you can do on the screens, like is if with these types, it's not going to change that much, right? So unless there's like
yeah,
probably like maybe if there's like a huge advancement in some other area, they might, who
yeah.
knows, or they
But
might come out with a different. I don't even know if they need to
But
then,
you
right?
can you can also take a look at the history of JavaScript because
mhm,
for a while there was ES3 and then they were
yeah,
planning to do a big change with ES4. And like
yeah,
because it was such a big change, everybody was up in arms and it never happened. And then
yeah,
ES5 came out and then ES6 was the big change that everybody wanted in ES4 that basically like revolutionized everything. But when you have these giant changes, it's just like doesn't, half the
yeah.
people like it, the other half the people hate it.
Well, because
So
the other
Well,
half, they're scared that they have to learn something too, I think is part of it, right? They're comfortable.
yeah. It's also, it causes issues because you think about all of the things that have already been built and legacy stuff that's out there, and any large update has to be backwards compatible. And I think what they're doing with browsers sort of makes sense where they have experimental features where, like, okay, you can use this experimental whatever. Like I remember not too long ago, I was looking into a masonry grid sort of layout for CSS. And there's like an experimental like masonry CSS property, but it doesn't work on any browser,
Nope.
right? So it's like, so, but I think that's like a lot of what happens is they create experimental features and then browsers choose if they want to adopt it. And
Well,
if they do, then it becomes sort of something that everyone adopts. And if they don't, then it's not because you're sort of at the whim of browsers at this
yeah, well,
point.
that's the other interesting thing, right? Is browsers have gotten they're so power. I mean, they are powerful software, and like when you think about it, it's like software now is all basically web-based. So it's all got
Yeah.
to go through the browser. So they are kind of like the bottleneck or gatekeeper, if you want to think of it that way, right? As to what's going to change, what updates do they feel like making? Because they also all have to kind of make them collectively. Otherwise, like you said, stuff won't work. It just
Yeah.
won't work on everything.
Yeah, I'm curious. There's a bunch of people watching, so I'm curious. Does anybody have anything that they've seen as either a junior developer, mid-level developer, or just something that you've noticed where you're like, ah, that person's like totally a junior developer because they're doing this one thing. Because there's just so many of them out there. I mean, we talked about briefly about a bunch of them already. I know, like to me, this embodiment thing is a really big one, and we touched upon it. But I think one of the best ways to sort of overcome that is to when you're choosing like, okay, this is my life path now, this is what I'm going to do, is to realize that there is no finish line, right? That's what we're just talking about is there's no finish line. So as soon as you can, you have to start declaring yourself as a developer and say, this is what I am, this is what I'm doing. Doesn't matter what level you are, but if you're actively chasing this goal of becoming a developer, you are a developer. That's what we all are doing there. And I think that's one of the I would say this is another point that's really important is I think junior developers get to this point where they've learned a couple technologies and they're like, cool, I can make a website now. And then they just stop learning,
Yeah.
right? They're like, cool, I can do this. And then they're not, sometimes they don't find interest in all of these new technologies. And they're like, okay, I've got there. And that I think is as big of a pitfall, right? Is feeling comfort and like content in what you've learned so far because this job is one of continuous learning. There's no end in sight for it. Go
Mhm.
ahead.
Yeah, you
I
have to
have
love learning. Oh, I was gonna
um,
sorry. Go ahead, you can go
well,
for it.
I was gonna suggest another thing that kind of hints of junior developer.
Yeah.
If you
Let's
guys are
let's call
finished, I
it
wasn't sure if you're
stinks of
No,
junior
go ahead.
developer.
okay. Okay, cool. Yeah. Poor Git practices. So
Mm.
always coding on the main branch, not
Hmm.
even using Git to begin with, but always coding on the main branch. Uh, like making massive commits as opposed to just little feature type commits, that
Yeah.
type of thing. And deleting other people's branches and
Yes.
things like that.
Delete.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great one. And I think, you just made me think about this, but this is a great one. So that it's funny because that happened to me where a
Well,
developer
that's why I
deleted a
said
branch of mine. I know.
Yeah.
And but what's more important there, I think the lesson to be taken away from that is the really important thing that senior developers tend to do better than junior developers is communicate, right? Is actually talk to the people that you're working with. Bryce said, "What's Git?" It's not a big deal, Bryce. You don't need to know
Yeah,
Not
it.
important.
it's not compatible
Yeah.
with Python. You'll be fine.
Yeah. No, but communication is huge, right? Like if you want to become a really high quality developer, you need to learn how to communicate effectively, right? Not just communicate, but communicate effectively. So how to actually talk to people about what's going on, any changes in the software that you've made, anything that they need to know before they need to know it,
Also, just
what
not
you're
being
going to
afraid
do.
to ask questions and communicate in general. Because I think
Yes.
that is like the number one thing. And we all are there, right? When you're first starting out, you feel like you don't know a lot. So you're also
Yeah.
scared to ask or to communicate or to look like an idiot, right? You don't
Yeah.
want to look like you don't know. But that actually is way worse than just saying, "Hey, I don't understand what you're talking about. Can you explain it to me?" People understand that you're new, right? Like it's okay. But that actually makes you look more competent and more like a senior developer by just saying that than not
Well,
saying it at all.
Yeah.
how do you deal with that? Because you make an excellent point where like being brave and having enough courage to ask questions is important because if you know the answers to all the questions, you're not going to gain anything from being in that room or that group with people if you already know all the
Yeah.
answers. But if you don't, it can oftentimes be intimidating to ask those questions. So how do you deal with that?
I have one way. Obviously, you have to be in a room with people who are more intelligent than you, and that's just like a general good business practice. Like if you want to learn stuff, you got to find people who know more than you. If everybody around you knows less than you, then you're the smartest person in the room, and that doesn't really help you learn
Typical
anything.
programmer.
Typical programmer. The other thing
Yeah.
that I would say is, and I see this in our group too in the web dev incubator, is that those developers who tend to get the most out of our program have a lot of curiosity, right? And I think that's a good way to sort of frame it in your mind is having curiosity about anything, right? And not like, hey, I'm ashamed of asking this. We all were novice developers at one point. We all had to learn these things and we did it in one way or another, whether that's looking at a tutorial, asking somebody, whatever it is, reading a book, but that all comes from curiosity. And there's, we say this in the group a lot is like there's no dumb questions, right? There everybody's at a different level and actually you help other people who are more senior by asking those questions because they have to figure out a way to frame it in their head and explain it to you. Right. So I think having that curiosity is really important. Go ahead,
I was
Danny.
gonna say too, yeah, and I think that's a good point is framing it as a curiosity question can be a good way to overcome that barrier of fear. Like
Yeah.
not like I don't know this, but oh, that's interesting. Can you explain that to me? Like
Yeah.
that kind of approach can be very helpful, and people respond to that. People love teaching other people. And if you
Yeah.
do run into a situation where you ask a question like that and somebody comes back to you really mean or like belittling, that's not a good person to work with. That's
Yeah.
also a good
Totally.
lesson, right?
Yeah.
Like because there are
You
a
know,
lot of people out there like that. I mean, we've ran into that ourselves, right? With like these
oh, totally.
developers that like I think it's also too, I do wonder if a lot of senior developers too that like have been in the industry a while are also threatened because like people
Yeah.
can learn so fast now and it's so much easier that it's like
I
you can
think,
get very used to adopting new technologies very quickly as a young developer
yeah.
now and like or a new developer and it might be scary to people who are,
I think
been
it
in the industry for a
depends
while.
on the developer you talk to
Of
because
course,
I
yeah.
have interacted with a lot of senior developers who are uh, just super brutal to novice developers in terms of like you'll never make it, there's no point in even learning this, whatever, like that kind of stuff, which is totally untrue. But then I've had senior developers who've been sort of mentors to me, like one of them in particular who I've worked with, who I was showing a lot of stuff to when I was first starting out. And he was one of the most encouraging people to me. He was like, this looks amazing. You're integrating all these different technologies. Like, keep going, keep building more of these projects. And what's funny is people have this assumption that I think this is actually a really important point is that a lot of people have this assumption that senior developers are just like magicians, right? Like they just know all this stuff and they're just magic. He This person that I'm talking about, he used ChatGPT more than any other developer I know. He's
Oh
built
yeah.
entire apps just by prompting ChatGPT and reviewing the code to make sure it's right. Because he's like, why would I go through the effort of like he already knows it all. So he's like, why would I
Yeah.
go through the effort of writing all this out when I can just have ChatGPT write it for me in less time and with high accuracy where I can just review it and put all the pieces together. And it's funny because
I totally do that now with certain stuff because I don't feel like
yeah,
writing it out because I've done it so many times. So I'm
yeah,
just like, this is what I want, do it, and then I just copy it, and then I just go through and edit it to what I want.
yeah.
And
Now
because there's
here's
always going to be errors in ChatGPT. That's the only
yeah,
downside.
there is. And that's the important point here, I think, too, is as a junior developer, you don't want to just do that because you can't just review the code. But I'm just saying that because I want to sort of dispel this rumor that senior developers have some special thing. They just do the same thing that we do as junior developers. They just do it more efficiently.
They also make mistakes a lot.
Yeah, of
There's also
course.
lots of problems. They're also at the whim of the companies they work for and stuff. They work for other people. Like, you know, it's easy to like, I think it's really easy. And I'll tell an example. This is from college, but I think it's a good example. I know Randall knows it really well. But this is when I was in undergrad, I was doing my thesis, and my advisor was probably like, I always think it was much older, but I don't, he was probably like 60. In my head, I always think it was like 80, but I was like, I was like 20. So it's like, you know what I mean? But I was super frustrated because I was working on this like really difficult idea for a thesis. And I was like, I was like, it's so easy for you. I just don't get it. Maybe I'm just like not cut out for this. And he just started
Hmm.
laughing at me. And he's like, I have like 4 decades on you. He's like
Yeah.
doing just this thing for
Yeah.
4 decades that you're interested in. He's like, I've read way more books. I've read them multiple times. He's like, it's just experience. Like, and it's
Yeah.
true. And I think it's so easy to forget that because we're lied to all the time about all these stories of people who just like wake up and then they're billionaires. And nobody
Yeah.
talks about the work they did. Nobody talks about the failures or the projects or the time they put into it or anything. And I think it makes us think that if we're not excellent at it immediately, we can't do it. And I think that's the biggest lie we can tell
Yeah.
ourselves.
You made me think of something else that I think is a big mistake that junior developers make, and that is they get through some sort of milestone, whether that's going through like a Udemy course or a boot camp or something like that. And obviously, your first goal is to start making money. So a lot of junior developers go straight into like building a portfolio and a resume. And while those are important, I think that it's actually more important to build real things because at the end of the day, your resume and your portfolio get looked at for about 10 seconds, right? Like it's really small, like
If even at all,
if even
if
at all. I mean,
it,
the reality is your LinkedIn profile probably matters more. I mean, I get recruiters who contact me all the time. And what's funny is they'll contact me for jobs where I'm like not qualified. Like there are languages that I
dude,
don't
they do that
have
all the time
anywhere
to me
listed
too.
on my, yeah. And I'm like, do you guys actually read what you're posting, like what you're contacting me about? Or they're like, hey, I have this in-office job in Kentucky. And I'm like, you couldn't have just looked that I live in Florida, like, like for one second, right? So, but what
I had a guy contact me about C# for like a week leaving
yeah,
messages. I was
dude,
like,
like
I don't do
like, yeah,
that.
like it happens all the time. And I think, that
Yeah.
just goes to show that what I think people should focus more on, especially as a junior developer, is projects, right? Because you're gonna make your resume look good by the companies that you work for. But when you're a junior developer, these companies aren't going to hire you based on your resume.
Cool.
Like that's the hardest way to find a job as a developer is to just put your resume everywhere. The easiest way is to build cool things that people use because then people will headhunt you. They're going to be like, who made this thing? Right.
Well, the
So I
other
think
side of
that's a
that too
huge
is I
one.
think with building projects is one of the things I think a lot of junior developers miss out on is seeing the whole project from start to finish
Yeah.
and building whole projects that gives you that perspective. Because like
Yeah.
think about it, like I mean, and coding used to be like that. Like you used to get a job out of college and spend years as a junior developer under somebody else, only doing little parts of stuff, and you wouldn't really get to
Yeah.
that larger picture till later, but now you can. And knowing that is such an advantage because even if you get a job for a company, knowing like how everything connects together makes you way more valuable and
Yeah.
way more, you just understand the process way better. And I think you're right, like building projects is the single best thing you can do. And
Yeah.
most people don't do it.
Not only that, but you learn tech stacks too and what works well together and what is efficient. And I think that's super helpful, especially when you're going into a company that's not like fully built out, which is more likely what you're going to get as a junior developer. Like it's a lot easier to get a job at a
Startup or
startup
something,
or
or yeah.
something. Yeah. And a lot of times startups are they're business people who are starting a software company. And so they don't understand anything about software. And it's your job as the developer to sort of guide them through this infinite world of different technologies they could possibly use and help them like figure out, okay, what are the different services we need to provide? What are the features? And then what tech stack makes the most sense for that.
You know, another thing I think that another mistake junior, well, two mistakes junior developers make is, and I think we all went through this too, so I'm not like pointing fingers, but one is shiny object syndrome, like
Yes.
thinking you're learning stuff and then moving on to the next thing as soon as it gets hard, because you just want
Yes.
you want that like you want that, that endorphin rush of like I'm learning, I'm progressing. And so,
Yeah.
but you hit that like point of like I don't know what to do from here, so let me just switch to another language, and then it feels good because you're like I'm learning like simple data structures again and all that stuff
Yeah.
and like data types and
That's a
whatever.
really good one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people get trapped in that instead of like, so I think focusing on a specific path is really good. And you
Yeah.
should like limit the languages you're learning to like a core set or a tech stack and focus
Yeah.
on building stuff instead of trying to learn everything. And then the other thing I was going to say was, if I didn't forget it,
Forgot it.
I think I forgot it. That's all right.
It's
I'll
okay. Well,
remember in a second. It
yeah.
was
No,
related.
I think that's a really good one, because I definitely found myself doing that. And I
Oh
know a
yeah.
lot of developers do. When it gets hard, we just tend to like switch to something else that feels easier. But you actually learn so much more when it's difficult. And again,
Oh,
we have these amazing tools. Go
I
ahead,
remember
Danny.
the other thing. The
Yeah.
other thing was, and also thinking you need to know everything before you move on. Because we've seen this
Yeah.
a lot, and I remember thinking this myself with like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like, I need to know all of it before I can move on to framework. No, you don't. Move on to frameworks. Because the
Yeah.
reality is that's the modern world we live in. That's how people build, and that's how they code. They don't code in vanilla. So you should move on as
Yeah.
quickly as you can. Yes, you should be comfortable, but you're gonna keep this stuff is not like it's not like you move from vanilla into frameworks and you just don't learn JavaScript anymore. It's all
Yeah.
JavaScript.
I
So
mean,
you
we talk
keep
about this
learning
a
it.
lot, and I think what you're saying comes from something else, which is as a junior developer, we tend to be scared of breaking things,
Oh yeah.
right? Like there's no way of going back. And that's simply not true. Like, especially if you're using something like version
If you're using
control.
GitHub, right?
Yeah, if you're using Git, then you can always just step back to a previous version. So, I mean, this is a really good practice. I know Randall, our student inside the group, the other day was like going through this JavaScript mastery tutorial, and he's like, I'm gonna try doing this updating to next 15 instead of the Canary version. Do you think that's a good idea? And I was like, just make a Git commit, because if it
Yeah.
breaks, you just literally just jump back to where you were. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. And that's a really good point, is like using Git is a great tool, right? That you can use so that you can make mistakes and you can break things. And ultimately, if you do break something, guess what? You can, at the worst case scenario, just delete the whole
Well,
folder and
that's
start
the
over,
funniest
you
thing
know?
too about like when you're, because I mean, I know we all went through this. I went through this. We're like, when we
Yeah.
were in the boot camp, I was terrified of breaking things. But it's like
Yeah.
when you look back, it's like I could have just remade it. Who cares? Like
Yeah.
even, I mean, these were like, it's not like I was like doing something for like production. They're like
Yeah.
personal projects you're working on. Who gives a F if you break it? And worst
Yeah.
comes to worst, you rebuild it, you get the experience of doing all that over again.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, a lot of that came from when we were working in React and Next.js. Well, in the boot camp, we were just working in React, but nobody ever explained anything in that folder.
Anything.
They're just like install it and then let's just copy this and paste
Dude,
this
they
into this
literally
folder.
never explain the file structure at
Never.
all in the
Yeah.
directory. Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of my like fear came from, was like, I don't know what any of these things are doing. So if I delete one character in one file, it could break the whole thing. And then I have to look through 100 different files to figure, like, imagine they never even explained to us what node modules were. So imagine if you like change
Yeah.
something in node modules and then you had to dig through that folder to find the semicolon or something that got erased. It's just impossible. So I
Oh,
think that was a lot of it for me. Yeah, go ahead,
I have
Danny.
one other really important one, I think, which is error messages. Learning
Mm,
how to read them appropriately and using them to debug. I think a lot of
yeah,
junior developers don't understand, like they get terrified of error messages, but like
yeah,
they have so much good information. And like if you get comfortable and start looking at them and reading them and start, it is annoying. Sometimes they can be very different, but they usually point you to the file that has the issue. So
yeah.
if you
And the
actually
exact
look,
line
yeah,
too.
literally the exact
Yeah,
line, the exact problem. Like if you look at them carefully and if you learn to read error message carefully, it can be a huge boom in your own learning progress. And with that, I would also say like another thing junior developers I think forget about a lot too is error handling.
Yeah,
Like learning how
in their
to
code.
use try and catch and learning how to like actually create errors that like make sense for the user so that the user experience is smooth and that you don't want them to see an entire like throw up of like a developer type error message that gives them all this information
Yeah,
and can teach them how to basically hijack your app.
yeah, absolutely.
Talking about hijacking apps, that's another thing junior developers can mess up with is hard coding credentials,
Oh yeah.
exposing API keys,
We're looking at you,
creating
Bryce.
creating
Yeah.
backdoors, all those things which are poor practices, but there's stuff that's taught to entry level developers all the time, and they're like, you
Our
never want
boot
to
camp
do
did that,
this.
right? Like, remember we
Yeah,
were
yeah,
hard
exactly.
Yeah.
coding passwords. Like,
Yeah.
That,
And
that
and
was
unfortunately, when you're creating stuff, you get in the habit of creating this hard-coded password and then you forget to remove it in a production app.
yeah, totally. No,
well, that was what
that's a
happened in one of
great
those
point.
that was what happened in one of those crypto things too, where the guy hard coded like literally the passwords in a plain text file or something.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I would say that's not even a junior mistake. That's like a mid to senior level mistake because literally last session in the web dev incubator, Randall showed us uh
Oh,
how hackers like find API keys by
Super
simple
easy.
searches. Yeah, like
yeah,
super
we did
easy.
a GitHub in the web dev incubator. We did a GitHub search for open AI API keys, and it's just
Yeah.
a
So
simple
that's
search. You can
ChatGPT API keys
Yeah,
for anybody who
and there
doesn't
were
know. Yeah.
14,300 exposed API keys. And then there's a ton of other
And
API keys you could
and that
search
What's
for
was
as
crazy too
just
well.
is
on GitHub
and
too,
what's
right?
crazy
There's
too is GitHub will notify you if your thing's public. If it's private, it won't, but it will notify you if it's exposed, which is crazy too, because that means like,
yeah.
yeah,
I
Hmm.
mean, that's pretty mind-blowing and just shows you how little developers sometimes understand security, right?
yeah,
Even like developers who are working production. And I think that's a good point too, is like just assuming that you're not good enough, right? I know like when I was a junior developer and just starting out, I was like, all these developers know so much who are building all this stuff. And sometimes that can prevent you from actually learning more because you're
you're
just
scared.
comparing,
Yeah.
yeah, you're comparing yourself to other people. And the reality is all developers make mistakes, like every single one of them, all the way up to senior level.
That's the other, actually, that's one last thing I'll say for a mistake junior developers make too is comparison to other people.
Yeah,
Like, and that's a
totally.
mistake we all make. I think whenever we're learning, whenever we're trying to do something new, it's not just developers, but like it limits or it causes so much stress and fear and just limits our ability to grow. And also, it's just unfair comparisons to begin with
Yeah.
because you're different people. Like, compare yourself to yourself, look
Yeah.
at your own growth, and focus on that as your metric for success.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And you see that inside the group too, is like the developers who are working in there are really focused on looking at who they were as a developer 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago, right? And
And don't get me
that's
wrong, sometimes the
super.
people in the group piss me off too because I'm like, they're getting so much done. Damn, I
Yeah,
gotta do
but
more. Yeah,
and that's the
it's
thing. You're
easy.
comparing yourself to other
Yeah,
developers, Danny. You got to compare
I
yourself to
know.
yourself. But we also only have so many hours in the day. Like, unfortunately, there's only so much you can do. And um, yeah, it's not helpful to really ever compare yourself to other people because
Never.
all you're doing is framing things in a way where you're like, there's no time when you're like, compare yourself and you're like, I'm so much better than them.
No, you always
Like, you
lose,
always
right?
find somebody who's a higher level than you to compare yourself.
And you're always looking at one thing, never at like the
Right.
whole person, right? Which is always the issue too.
Yeah. Well, we're past 30 minutes. Do you guys have any last minute
Yeah.
developer tips? I think really, if I were to sum it up, just keep learning. There's never an end to it.
Build
Keep
projects.
develop.
Yeah.
Yeah, build lots of projects, build stuff that you're interested in, right? And just keep being curious because that is really our role as developers is to just keep learning. Um,
It's like that thing that they say where good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things with coding where like in order to be a good developer, you need to be a bad developer for long enough to where
yeah,
you can
Yeah.
actually
Well,
learn to
that's
be a
where
good
that's
developer.
also, that's where you learn everything though. like your mistakes, overcoming them, you never forget that stuff. And that's where
Yeah.
you really learn like really like how things work, how they connect and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to end it with this, and it's not really meant to be a humble brag, but it's going to sound like that. But the other day I was having a conversation with my girlfriend, and I just love learning about like anything that I can get my hands on. And she asked me, um, you know, what made you want to like have so much knowledge, right? Because like sometimes like people are like, yeah, the way that's just the way things work in the world. But I'm always like, I want to understand why it's that way, right?
Mhm.
And she was like, what made you value knowledge so much? And I could pinpoint it like I guess specifically to one person in my life, which is like my grandfather. But if I was to really answer that question, it's it's not like I value knowledge so much. And this is what I said to her. I was like, it's not that I really value having this knowledge, like it makes me better than other people. I just have curiosity for the world, right? Like I just always want to understand why things are the way they are. And I think if you can sort of adopt that mentality when it comes to development of understanding, not just like, hey, we do a use state hook because that's how we do it, but why is it set up that way? Like what makes it that, right? If you can adopt that sort of mentality of having curiosity about everything that you do in development, you're going to get a lot further because you're not going to just take things at face value, and you understand this sort of deeper core concepts that build up to what we have. So I want to just sort of
No, I think that's a great way to end
leave
it
it
too. That's
off
a
with
good
that.
point.
But
Yeah.
Mhm.
yes, Charles, we had Netflix issues last night.
Well, I think that
You,
I was actually just answering him, and I said it's hard to
oh,
answer though because it could be like it was probably more likely a server resources thing. They didn't allocate enough, and there too many people watched at once. Because that's
yeah,
usually what happens with those services, and they don't really care because they
yeah.
already
I
have your
mean,
money.
what basically happened with that is like a DDoS attack. If you think about it, right? There's like a DDoS is like a distributed denial of service. So, Randall, could you enlighten us a little bit on what a DDoS attack is?
Yeah, so
I mean, I
basically
can if
there
you want,
yeah,
but
so there's too many requests for the available resources. And so it can sometimes overload whatever resources you have. Now, a lot of times, with modern cloud resources, they'll have what are those load balancers and different things like that, and they'll have
yeah,
different like Amazon has CloudFront and different endpoints so that it can handle all of that. But this was probably one of the biggest events ever, and even if they were expecting a lot of people, they probably got a lot more people than they were even expecting.
yeah,
And they could, who knows, there could have also been a DDoS attack against
Yeah.
all of the
yeah,
Netflix servers
yeah.
at that time. So
That would have been a
I
perfect
think,
yeah,
time to actually do it anyway, because you know you're going to get a
yeah,
lot of watchers, so you're going to get a lot of people
mhm.
already trying to get on
I
there.
think, I think also what happens is as soon as there's probably like a cascading effect that happens a little bit too. So as soon as one server starts denying requests, people start reloading their page over and over and opening multiple tabs and stuff, and that just compounds the issue even further.
Well, we forget
Because
too that all of these requests, they do take time. Even though it's
yeah,
like a very small amount of time, it is
yeah,
time. And that adds up really fast when you have millions of people all trying to do it at once, you
yeah,
know?
it is quite a feat to think that we can have a live feed of something happening all over the world on multiple different devices with different operating systems, like all these
Yeah.
different technologies working seamlessly together is almost magical. So,
The
like when it
buttons
breaks,
and
Stretch.
magic. That's
yeah, yeah, buttons, magic.
yeah.
Magic.
Yeah, so I don't think there's too much that developers could have done. I mean,
That could also have been a
obviously
resource
they'll
thing
learn
that,
something from it,
yeah.
and that's the point is like you learn something from errors, and that's all you can really do. Yeah, live feed worldwide is impressive. Too bad
The
the
fight
fight was
was
lame.
lame.
Yeah.
Yeah, too bad.
Yeah.
All
Well, with
right.
that, thank you guys for hanging out with us on this Saturday. If you are interested in having an amazing community of other developers who are committed to this idea of becoming a web developer, then you should probably join our web dev incubator. It's an amazing community where we have a bunch of the people you see in the comments here. We all hang out together live on Zoom, discuss what we did this week, and how we can keep each other accountable and learn about code and share code. And we even have a Telegram group so you can communicate with everybody throughout the week. So if it's something that you're interested in, you can book an action call with us, either by reaching out to us, or we'll drop the link in the description here. Yeah, and book an action call. We'll discuss sort of where you are, give you some free mentoring, and if you're interested in joining, we can get you signed up.
And how to
Um,
move from thinking about it to being a real developer.
yeah. Also, if you are a super junior developer and you want to learn the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we have a cool course. It's called the Web Dev Kickstarter, and you can find that at codenoobs.io/courses. You get to learn all about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with Danny here, and then you get to build a Chrome extension with me, where we implement the Pokemon API, and yeah, you build some cool stuff. So that's a great way to sort of get your feet wet and learn the basics, the core understanding of web development. And then from there, you can jump in our web dev incubator group, and learn the rest of the stuff like Next.js and APIs and backend services, all that cool stuff. So with that,
Nice.
thank you guys for tuning in today. If you are in the web dev incubator, we'll see you in about 20 minutes, for our weekly motivation and accountability call. And otherwise, have a great rest of your Saturday, and we'll see you next week.
Later, Alex.
Peace. See ya.